All right, guys, so we're going to look at the transition from kind of the nonviolent movement into kind of more radical movements. So again, the mid 60s, despite kind of successes with legislation, segregation was still very prominent. Now, when we talk about segregation, I want you to think of there's two types of segregation, okay? There is de facto segregation, where it's not necessarily, written down or by law, but it's kind of just determined by social norms, or the way it's always been. So the way that I used to remember this is like de facto, it's a fact of life. It kind of just is the way it is. So when you think of de facto segregation, sometimes it's unintentional with neighborhoods are often you can kind of see a division between white and black neighborhoods or so on. That would be an example of de facto segregation. De jure segregation is segregation that is going to be enforced by law. So when we talk about segregation of public places, so water fountains, pools, public parks, restaurants, transportation, all of those things were going to be backed up and enforced by law. So de facto, just a way of life. De jure segregation is segregation by law. So when we talk about slow progress, okay, it was obviously very frustrating to those people who were facing discrimination, nonviolent protests, but were still being faced with violence. And kind of the key turning point was going to be the assassination of Medgar Evers. Okay, he was going to be a civil rights activist, and he is going to be assassinated and gunned down in his driveway. So this is kind of the turning point, and it's kind of sparks a lot of these civil rights leaders to question whether nonviolent methods were successful. Okay, some questions. So, okay, is it okay to use self-defense? So using into a little bit more violent tactics. Should assimilation or combination of races be the goal? And you see this big idea of racial pride. Okay, so we see kind of Black pride move out of this movement. Okay, so we'll see this in several different ways. Okay, so you see, if you don't know, this is Martin Luther King Jr. With Malcolm X, and these really are two of the faces of kind of this two opposite approaches. So Martin Luther King Jr., we kind of see him as the face of the nonviolent civil rights movement, and then Malcolm X we see as a little bit more radical and extreme. Okay, so some different, more radical organizations are going to be known as the Nation of Islam. So the founder of that is going to be Elijah Muhammad. And under the ideals of the Nation of Islam is to encourage African Americans to separate their communities. Okay, so to promote Black nationalism, Black pride, and not to worry literally about segregation and just kind of like accept the fact and rise up the Black community. Okay, so again, big differences there and kind of accepting separate and even encouraging separateness. And again, the use of self-defense is going to be a big difference when we see that in the versus the nonviolent movements. Okay, Malcolm X, again, he is going to be kind of the main spokesperson. Again, we see him as the face, as the more radical, more vocal about self-defense movement. Okay, so he kind of gets adopted into this idea of the Nation of Islam. His name was Malcolm Little. He takes the name X because, again, most of the times when African Americans were enslaved, they took the last name of their master as their own. So he didn't want to have any connection to that or any identity that may have been lost due to slavery. So he just takes Malcolm X. Okay. So again, very similarly, he's preaching what the Nation of Islam believes. So separation from whites. So we should not be worried about integrating. We just need to be worried about keeping separate and again, kind of self-defense. So we see this idea of kind of fighting violence with violence. Now, when we see Malcolm X throughout the years, we see him kind of change his beliefs a little bit. And he actually kind of goes against the Nation of Islam beliefs and actually encourages, is that, okay, no, we don't need to be separate. We do need to be integrated. And he began kind of preaching things that didn't line up 100% with the Nation of Islam. So this upset other leaders of the Nation of Islam, and he is going to be assassinated by other members of the Nation of Islam. Another movement that stems from this is going to be the Black Power movement. Stokely Carmichael is a really great example that we use of this Black Power movement. And it's really impactful because he was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But again, he was one example where he got frustrated. There was no progress. He wasn't seeing goals being achieved enough. So he was going to help found the Black Power movement. Okay, again, this calls for African Americans to control their own social, political, and economic lives. Again, with the Black Power movement, they were willing to advocate force. So this is not going to be supported by King's followers. So Carmichael is going to be an example where he kind of broke away because he was frustrated with the nonviolent movement, and that would lead him to take more radical steps. Okay, probably one of the most radical groups is going to be the Black Panthers. And they were definitely kind of willing to use violence as a means of getting their equal rights. When we see the Black Panther Party, they did a lot of good in African American communities. They called for military exemption from Vietnam, kind of justifying if African Americans are not being treated equally within the United States, they should definitely not be called to the front lines of Vietnam to fight for a country that did not support them and were hateful and violent towards them. When we talk about Program for the People, they wanted to take care of their community. So one of the most impactful community measures that they took was creating a breakfast program for their neighborhoods that ensured that all children kind of had breakfast before they went to school, and kind of social measures like that. All right, where we kind of wrap up the civil rights movement is going to be with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. He was in Memphis, Tennessee. In the later months of his life, he really strived to get economic equality for African Americans. So this strike was mostly for African American workers who were not making equal wages. And it's kind of crazy, like we talked about with the conspiracy with like Lincoln's assassination. You can look at like Kennedy's assassination, where they like had dreams of them being killed or said odd quotes that kind of foreshadowed their own death. That same is true with King, who talked about the promised land in the last speech that he made, and mentioned that he was not afraid to die. He is going to be assassinated in the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. The sniper that was used to kill him was literally just kind of found on the sidewalk, and the fingerprints connected it back to James Earl Ray. Lots of conspiracies that you could kind of look up with. Again, kind of family of James Earl Ray. He wasn't really smart enough to pull that off, so that he had to be kind of like provoked or encouraged by outside people. Lots of different things. But he will be arrested and jailed for the assassination of King. And this is going to be really detrimental to people. People are just devastated when the news gets out, and it causes strikes to break out in Memphis, in Atlanta, his original hometown, in Washington, D.C., just devastated over this. But his life was definitely used to further move the civil rights movement. Okay, so that is it. That's where we're going to wrap up. So again, looking at the time frame, we see the outside stuff going on the Cold War, but definitely wanted to end not discounting or leaving out the civil rights movement.